Thanks, Kerlock. So this bill is welcome in that it addresses a pretty scandalous problem that exists out there of student accommodation providers charging for 51 weeks when the student's term is only 41 weeks. So that's a positive that is going to be prevented, and the fact that students can't be required to pay more than a month's rent and deposit in advance, other than their fees, if they happen to be paying their fees to the student provider. So those are welcome things, and indeed the ability to take a landlord to the RTB who is behaving improperly. So those are positive developments which the student unions have been campaigning for, and well done to the students for getting the government to take these steps. But there's a hell of a lot more to be done, and that's really what I want to focus on in the time I have available to me. I was talking to the USI new campaigns officer, vice president, just before I came in here, and I said, what's the situation going to be like in come September, October for the students? He says it's going to be an absolute shambles. It's going to be a disaster for thousands and thousands of students. He informed me that last year there was a shortfall of 30,000 student accommodation units, a shortfall of 30,000, and that the consequence of that is students sleeping in their cars, sofa surfing, or commuting for hours and hours and hours in order to get to college. Something that also UCD, among others, have produced reports about the mental stress that imposes on students. So there's a very serious crisis still persisting in terms of the availability of student accommodation, and for those that can find it, the rents are exorbitant in many cases. I was just again ringing the former campaigns officer from UCD. I also talked to him before this, and I was just asking how much the rent is for this newly built student accommodation out in UCD, and he reckoned, now this is off the top of his head, but the 41 weeks, which is the shorter term, if you like, the actual term, that you're talking between 11 and 15,000 euro. It's absolutely extraordinary, and that's for accommodation provided by UCD, by the National University. To be charging those sort of rents is absolutely outrageous. And again, UCD have done surveys showing the mental health impact. Students struggle to pay those rents, the pressure it puts on them, the impact it has on their general quality of their student experience. And similarly, with a lot of these private providers building student accommodation, charging similarly extortionate levels of rent. So the measures in this bill are welcome, and we'd be happy to support them, but a hell of a lot more needs to be done. It is absolutely crazy, to be honest, that we should be making it difficult for people to get through college. And of course, many students drop out because of the lack of student accommodation or the mental health pressures that are put on them, trying to get student accommodation and failing, or struggling to pay extortionate rents, along with all the other financial burdens that students have. The students have time and time again called for the complete abolition of registration fees to remove that financial burden, which, you know, along with rents and the cost of accommodation, puts such pressure on students. to cut a long story short, we should be doing everything to remove financial obstacles or any other obstacles to people being able to access higher and third level education and complete higher and third level education, particularly at a time when we have chronic skills shortages all over in multiple sectors of our society, in health and construction and education and so on. The idea that we continue to allow financial and other barriers to make it difficult for people to access higher and third level education or to complete it is just, it's irrational. It's utterly irrational. So we need to be taking far more bold measures to remove those obstacles, financial and others, of which the question of student accommodation is an absolutely key one. The other consequence, or one of the other consequences of the lack of affordable student accommodation and sufficient supply of student accommodation is the people being pushed into digs accommodation, and USI also asked me to ask you, the Minister, to move forward the digs legislation that was discussed in here, I think, last week, in terms of the situation for people who are having to go into digs but often have great insecurity in terms of their accommodation, often face lack of access to facilities in the accommodation because of the whims of the landlord who's providing that accommodation, things like the right to lock their own door in the accommodation and other issues like that. So that is another ask from the student union movement, is that that legislation should be done, and done as quickly as possible. The other ask USI had for this discussion was when is the student accommodation strategy plan going to be published? It was promised, according to USI, last July, and it still hasn't been published. So that's again a request. It would be interesting to hear from the Minister as to when is that actually going to happen. But given the scale of the student accommodation crisis and the fact that we're going to be entering into that crisis again very, very soon, surely there should be a far greater degree of urgency from the government in producing that student accommodation plan and addressing the issue of the lack of supply of affordable on-campus, directly provided by the colleges and by the government student accommodation, but that at the very least we should show the urgency to actually deliver that promised plan. The other thing I just thought I'd mention, connected on the student accommodation front, and it kind of sums up the problem we have in terms of the over-reliance on private for-profit providers of student accommodation, and how that is, if you like, not the way forward for delivering the affordable student accommodation we need. In my constituency, there's a iconic site, I suppose you would call it, a place called Baker's Corner in Dean's Grange, which is a pub you probably know it, Malcolm. A developer got that site and got planning permission for strategic housing development on that site to build student accommodation. The student union at the time opposed that SHD, lodged objections to it, as I did. It was often thrown against me in soundbite politics here. Oh, Richard Boyd Barrett objected to this, that and the other. I objected along with the student union at the time, because we felt that the developer was only putting in the planning application to maximise the profit out of the site. He got a strategic housing development permission for 276 apartments. That developer has not built anything. They finally got through after objections, and there was a judicial review and so on and so forth. As soon as they got the permission, guess what they did? Put the site up for sale. €7 million, right? So private property speculators getting strategic housing permission for student accommodation right beside IADT, where it's an ideal site, and I want to make it absolutely clear, the students and myself and people before profit support the provision of student accommodation on that site. We want to see student accommodation, but what we actually got was property speculation by a private property speculator. And of course, even if they do, or some other private operator moves in on that site, if they've had to pay 7 million, what sort of rents are they going to be charging on that site? We're going to be talking about similarly unaffordable rents at the level I've described of 1,000, 1,500 a month, maybe 2,000 euro a month on a site which is right beside the college. Now, what should happen there, Minister? Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out what should happen. That site should be taken over by the college, i.e. by the government, to build the student accommodation. And another reason they objected to the developer's proposal was because Baker's Corner was one of the very, very few social spaces for the students. So they would like to see it developed with some social amenities for the students and affordable student accommodation. That's what should happen to that site. And even now, at this late stage, frankly, I mean, if it was a socialist government, we just flip and seize the site off that property developer. But it should be, there should some sort of compulsory purchase. And in fact, they shouldn't even benefit from the speculation on the site, in my opinion. It's absolutely outrageous when they got a strategic housing development permission for that site. There should be some way of clawing back the profiteering that clearly that developer was engaged in on this absolutely strategically important site in terms of the provision of student accommodation. But that kind of sums it up, because as we know, a lot of these developers are speculating with permissions, and if they do build, charging absolutely extortionate rents. That is not the way to solve the student accommodation crisis. What's actually necessary is for the government to provide on state-owned sites, on the college campuses, affordable student accommodation. And if we're talking about an announcement of the summer economic statement of budget surpluses of €8 billion and so on, the government certainly can't plead they don't have the money in order to put the capital investment in to build the affordable student accommodation that is required. Just one other mention from the from USI. DCU have announced, according to USI, on I think he said 3 occasions, plans to build new student on-campus accommodation up in DCU. Not a sod turned. They keep making the announcement, but they don't build it. Right? So I suggest that that issue should be addressed. Very lastly, I would say, given that, you know, even with all these measures being taken of the government, if they did ramp up to the level that's necessary to provide for that shortfall of 30,000 affordable student accommodations that are lacking, it's not going to happen by this October. Right? And we are going to face into the crisis one way or another again this September, October. In my view, the government should be looking at emergency measures to deal with that, providing emergency funding for emergency accommodation for students, and looking at repurposing buildings empty buildings near college or university campuses. I mean, I can think of, if you take UCD, I can think of multiple empty office blocks in the vicinity of UCD. If what we're facing is a situation of students being homeless, couch surfing, travelling for hours, and so on, some of those empty buildings should be purchased or taken over in some shape or form and repurposed to provide the emergency accommodation that may be necessary for many, many students who can't find the student accommodation that they need. So I'll leave it at that. We're happy to support the bill, but there's a hell of a lot more to be done, Minister.